Last winter, I moved to a new home in a new town. I'd only visited the town once for a job interview, and once I got it, I pretty much had to move there. It was a really big step up in my career, so I was really eager for everything to go well. Because the town was kind of in the middle of nowhere though, it made the moving process not so ideal. I had to find a home for rent online and go through the process that way. I know it's not the best way to go about it, but I thought it'd be okay since I'd only be renting for a year and I could always find somewhere else afterward. On December 1st, I packed up everything in my truck and made the drive. I only stopped to fill up the tank along the way, but even then, I didn't make it into town until 9. Like I said, I had been here before when I did the job interview, but I'd never seen the town at night before. It was kind of eerie, as the streetlights were very dim and most of the stores were closed, so all the lights were out. I wasn't used to these smaller towns, so this was very different to me. There wasn't anyone driving around either. It almost felt like I was driving through a ghost town. Another 5 minutes later, I pulled into the neighborhood and up to my new house. It was very small and was in a row next to other similar houses. I parked on the driveway and got my air mattress out, then headed inside. I had sold basically everything before the move, planning to buy new stuff once I got here, so I knew I'd be stuck with an empty home for a while. Inside, though, the place was about what I expected. It was old and outdated. The wooden floorboards creaked with every step, and the house had a musty smell to it. The layout was simple, though. It was one floor with a kitchen and living room, and one long hallway leading to the 2 bedrooms. After quickly looking around, I turned the lights back off and went into the master bedroom, tossing the air mattress down and turning on the pump to get it full. I sat on the floor, tired from the long drive and the stresses of moving, but as I was sitting there, I heard a creak from the other side of the house. It was just one small creak, but it was very distinct, sounding exactly like one of the floorboards. My initial thought was that it might be a raccoon or something that had taken up shelter in the empty home. So I got up and went down the hallway toward the living room. I didn't even bother walking to the front of the room to turn the lights back on. I just glanced around. The room was just as empty as it was before though. I didn't see any signs of anything. I figured it was nothing. Maybe being tired and stressed made me overthink it. After all, this was a new home, so I wasn't familiar with any of the sounds it may be making. I went back to the bedroom. The mattress was full now, so I tossed a blanket on it and laid down. Tomorrow I had a lot to do, so I wanted to get as much sleep as I could get. Despite the not so great setup, I passed out pretty soon after laying down. When I woke up, I remember opening my eyes and seeing absolute darkness. It looked like I still had my eyes closed. That's how dark it was. I knew it was sometime in the middle of the night, so I closed my eyes again to try and fall back asleep, when I heard something from just in front of me. It was one of the floorboards creaking. My eyes shot open again, and I quickly sat up. I stared ahead at where I heard the sound, but still, I couldn't make anything out. I sat there motionless. It was so quiet, I could hear my heart beating as I felt a disturbing sense around me. Then there was another creak. It was further to the left of where the last one was. In my head, I started to panic. Part of me didn't even think this was real, like maybe I was still half asleep or something. Before I could shake the feeling, there were 4 consecutive creaks, each sounding further toward the back of the room. Then there was a moment where I felt like I could see the slightest shape of something in the dark before the bedroom door swung open. The moonlight shining into the hallway immediately illuminated a man as he moved from my bedroom and into the hallway. I heard him sprinting to the other side of the house as I got up and rushed to turn on the lights. By then, the front door was wide open. From the glimpse of him that I got, he looked around 40 years old, with worn clothes and boots. That was about all I could see. I got my phone and keys, then got in my truck and drove away as I called the local police station. From everything I told them, they seemed to think that it was someone living in the house while it was unoccupied, but there's really no way to know for sure what was going on. If that was someone living in the home, it doesn't really explain what they were doing in my room, creeping around while I was asleep. Whatever the case, thankfully the owner let me break the lease and move to a different home. Had I not woken up that night, I don't know what would have happened. I had just moved across town into a small home on the outskirts. It was only 20 minutes away from where I lived, but it felt like it was more isolated and away from everything. It had a decent amount of tree-covered land, so I couldn't see any other houses or roads or anything, which made it feel really peaceful. On the day I moved in, though, I got a knock at the door around dinner time. It was an older man, like 50-ish, with long gray hair and sunken eyes. He greeted me, but there was clearly something off about him. He tried to make some small talk, but he was very awkward and had a straight, unamused face the whole time. It was a bit odd. After he left, I didn't think too much on it though. I thought it was probably just a nosy neighbor. But on the following day, while I was unpacking, there was another knock at the door. It was him again. The first thing I noticed was that he was still wearing all the same clothes that he had on yesterday, and he had that same straight face. He asked how everything was coming along, but strangely during our conversation, it felt like he didn't actually have any reason to talk to me. It was like he was dragging on the conversation just because. I had to abruptly end it after a few minutes because he just wouldn't go away. I told him to have a good night and closed the door on him. It was just getting kind of creepy at this point. I mean, I guess it would have been different if he was a really talkative and outgoing person that just wanted to meet his new neighbor, but he wasn't like that at all. He seemed like he didn't even want to talk and was just forcing himself to. I went back to unpacking, trying to forget about it, but he knocked on the door again. This wasn't a friendly knock. It was loud and demanding. I looked down the hallway at the door and could see a shadow behind the curtains that covered the window on the door. "Just leave. I'm sorry, but I have a lot to do tonight," I said, trying to keep my cool, but definitely letting the frustration show. He didn't move. He waited for another few seconds, then knocked again. At that point, I was extremely irritated and marched over to the door, prepared to yell at him. I swung the door open, and the man was standing much closer, only about a foot away from me. His eyes were dead, and his whole face and body was tense. It was like he was contemplating doing something. And that's when I looked down and saw the tip of a knife showing through the sleeve of his jacket. I slammed the door just as he pressed forward. By the time I locked it, he was already banging on the door again. It was almost even more disturbing because he wasn't saying anything anymore either, like he was possessed by whatever he was trying to do. I called the cops and double-checked every door was locked. The man stayed by the front door for several minutes, then hurried away. Cops didn't make it until well after he had left. I gave them my report of the incident, telling them that he was likely one of my neighbors. They found that nobody matching his description lived anywhere near me. None of the other neighbors had ever seen him either. We still don't know who he was, or if he's still wandering around our neighborhood anymore. Why exactly he came up to my house with a knife in his hand is unknown. Hopefully he's gone far away from here though. I had just graduated college. I didn't have much money, but was looking for a new job now that I had a degree. In the meantime, me and one of my buddies from college, Aaron, decided to rent a home and be roommates. He made a lot more money than I did, and planned on staying at the house after I moved out once I got a better job. The place was actually pretty cheap too, only a couple hundred more than some of the apartments around here, so split between both of us, it was definitely doable. The move-in went well. We each took a bedroom, then went to IKEA for the extra furniture that we needed for the living room. On the first day we arrived though, we got a letter on the door. It was just a note card taped near the door handle that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." I guess the note's not really that weird in itself, but it had no name or indication of anything. It was just a handwritten line saying, "Welcome to the neighborhood." It almost looked sarcastic. Anyway, a couple days went by as we got settled in before both of our vacation time from work was over and we had to start our normal routines again. I just worked at a pizza shop for the meantime. The first night I got home from work though, I noticed someone standing near our house as I pulled into the driveway. It was a woman. I couldn't see much as it was dark out, but she was just looking at one of our front windows. Once I pulled into the garage and walked back out to ask her what she was doing, she was gone. I thought it was weird, but probably nothing to worry about. She looked harmless enough, and clearly didn't want any trouble because she left. Later that night, I mentioned it to Aaron, and we both joked about it. Nothing else happened that night. Another week or so went by. By then, we felt pretty comfortable with the place, and were just living our lives. This night was normal. I had work until 10, but I knew Aaron got off at 8. Once my shift was over, I drove back home. During that drive though, I got a strange gut feeling. I don't know what it was, but something just felt off. Then I pulled up to the front of the house. The front door was wide open, but all the lights were off in the house. I obviously thought it was really weird, especially since Aaron was supposed to be home right now. I parked and walked up to the door. "Aaron, why is the door open?" I yelled from the porch. The house was silent. I took a few steps inside and looked around, then pulled out my phone and texted Aaron. Immediately when I sent the text, I heard his phone chime down the hall. When I looked, his phone was lighting up on the kitchen counter across the hallway. Now this was extremely strange. There was no way he went anywhere without his phone, and he definitely wouldn't have left the door open if he did. Aaron was always really picky about locking up the place before leaving. I wasn't really sure what to do, but something in me felt like I should check his room first to see if there were any signs I was missing. I went up the stairway and up to his room. The door was open, so I walked in. At first, it looked normal and it was quiet until I heard a voice behind me. I whipped around, seeing Aaron looking through a crack in the closet. Before I could say anything, he asked if I saw someone. I said no and was really confused, but he immediately told me to call 911. I knew instantly from the look on his face that this was very real, so I did what he said. We stayed quiet while on the phone, hiding in his room until the officers arrived. They came into the home, and right away, there were footsteps sprinting through the house. The cops were able to get them before they got away. It was a woman. She had restless eyes and was full of rage. It was then that Aaron told me what happened. He got home from work and tossed his stuff in the kitchen, and then went upstairs to change. While he was up there, he heard a loud crash by the front door, then footsteps walking through the downstairs. He had no idea who it was or how many people there were, but he was helpless without his phone. He thought they'd probably just rob the downstairs area and then leave. Strangely though, at some point while he was hiding, they walked around and turned off all the lights. Then they went to the back of the house and didn't move. Aaron waited there for an hour and a half until I got home. It's thought that Aaron must have gotten home just before she arrived, so she probably didn't even know he was there. Clearly, she wasn't there to rob the place though, and likely had been waiting for one of us to enter the home and walk down the hallway. Had either of us done that, who knows what she would have done. That night still scares the hell out of us, and of course, neither of us stayed at that house once the lease was up.
The Phantom Neighbor. My parents were away for a weekend, off to a last-minute business conference that couldn't be rescheduled. I had begged to stay home instead of going with them. I mean, who wants to spend days trapped in a hotel room with nothing to do? They finally agreed, leaving me with strict instructions to lock all doors, not to have any friends over, and to call them if anything happened. I agreed, just looking forward to having house myself, with some snacks and my favorite shows anyway. It was Saturday night and I had just settled into the couch with a bowl of popcorn when a phone rang. The thrilled tone made me jump. I picked it up. There was only static on the phone on the other end. Weird. I hung up, tried to shake off the unease and turned back to my movie. A few minutes later the phone rang again. Static. This time I waited, listening closely to catch any sound beyond the hiss. Was someone breathing? And then I heard it, faint, almost lost in noise. A name, Grayson. My heart skipped a bit. Grayson? I hadn't heard that name in years. It was the name of the old man who lived here next door before he died. Mr. Grayson was strange, always kept to himself. The neighbor kids used to tell stories about him. How he'd love to talk about people who weren't there. How he'd wandered around the night. After he died, no one moved in. His house just sat there empty, decaying. I hung up quickly, telling myself it was just a prank. Some kids messing around. But so no matter how much I tried to focus on the movie, my thoughts kept drifting back to the old house door. I found myself glancing at a window one more time. And the Grayson house seemed to hide something I couldn't see. Then out of nowhere, the TV screen flickered, and the image distorted. I stared at it confused. Was it the signal? But the weird thing was, the distortion wasn't random. The static morphed into shapes, letters almost, like someone was trying to write something. I grabbed the remote and hit the power button, but the TV stayed on. The letters on the screen became clearer, spelling out a single word, help. My breath caught in my throat. This had to be some kind of joke, right? But who had to go such lengths just to scare me? I shut the TV off manually and sat back, my heart racing. As I started to calm down, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. My head snapped towards the ceiling. There shouldn't be anyone else in the house. I listened intently, holding my breath. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving from one room to the next. I stood up, my mind racing. What should I do? Call the police? But what would I tell them? That my TV was acting up and I heard some noises? They'd laugh at me off the phone. But the footsteps were real, too real to ignore. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking, and slowly made my way upstairs. Each creak of the wood beneath my feet felt like thunderclap in the house. As I reached the top, I paused, listening. The footstep had stopped. Nothing was there but silence. I checked each room, my pulse pounding in my ear. Nothing. No sign of anyone. The rooms were exactly as they had been earlier. I was about to convince myself that it was just my imagination. When the lights flickered, the halfway hallway plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but when the lights came on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the attic, the one that had been locked for as long as I could remember, was now slightly ajar. I stared at it, frozen. I had never been in the attic. My parents always said it was just old junk up there. Nothing worth seeing. But now, standing there, I felt an almost magnetic pull towards it. I needed to know what was up there. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open and shined a flashlight up the stairs. The beam revealed some old boxes and a furniture covered in sheet. The air was heavy with a smell of mildew and something else. Something foul. I climbed steps cautiously, each one groaning under my weight. At the top, I swept the flashlight around, trying to see what had drawn me here. Then I saw it, a small, dusty TV in the corner, the kind you expect to see in the kids in the 80s. It was on, playing nothing but static. I approached it, my skin crawling unease. Why was this up here, and why was it on? I reached to turn it off, but as soon as my fingers touched the dial, the static cleared, and a face appeared on the screen. It was Mr. Grayson. He looked just as I remembered, graying hair, gaunt face, but his eyes were wide, desperately pleading. "Help me," he said, his voice distorted, echoing through the small attic. "They won't let me rest." I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam whirled crazily around the room as I scrambled to pick it up. When I looked back at the TV, the screen was blank, just static again. My mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming. I bolted down the stairs, my heart in my throat. I had to get out of this nightmare. But as I reached the bottom, something strange happened. The front door opened itself, as if inviting me to leave. The cold night air rushed in, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to go outside. Without thinking, I stepped out on the porch, but I didn't stop there. My legs carried me toward the Grayson house. It loomed in the darkness, its window like black eyes staring back at me. I should have turned around, run back to safety in my home, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me in, and I couldn't resist. I reached the front door of the Greyhound house, and to my shock it was slightly open. The hinges creaked as I pushed it wider. The air was thick with dust and something else, something old and rotted. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The darkness swallowed me, the only light coming from the shaky flashlight. The inside of the house was worse than I imagined. Furniture covered in dusty sheet, wallpaper peeling off in long strips, and a thick layer of grime coating each surface. Then out of the corners of my eye, I saw shadows moving, figures emerging from the walls. They were vague, ghostly shapes, their faces blurred, but I could feel their fury and hunger. They had to be the ones keeping Mr. Grayson here, trapping him in this nightmare. "Leave now," they hissed. "The living is not welcome here." Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needed to get out. I could hear the voices behind me, echoing through the hallways, but I didn't look back. I burst through the front door and out in the cold night, gasping for air. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, with a force that rattled the windows. The house stood there, dark and solid once more, as if nothing happened. I staggered back, my mind racing. What had just I seen? Was any of it real? But as I stood there trying to make sense of it all, I felt the presence behind me. Slowly I turned around, and there, in the window of the Grayson house, I saw Mr. Grayson's face one last time. He looked at me with those hollow eyes, his mouth forming one final desperate word, help. Then he was gone. I didn't stick around to see if he would come back. It was obvious that I could do nothing for him. I ran all the way home, not stopping until I was safely inside, the door behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that somehow, someday, they would find me again, because I knew that the dead don't rest, not in the house, not anymore. The hidden attic. It was a holiday break, and I had just finished my final exams. The thought of returning home, even for a few days, was welcome relief. My parents were thrilled to have me back, but a sudden snowstorm delayed their return from a last-minute work trip. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I relished it. The house, a cozy old structure, nestled in the countryside, and always been my sanctuary. I settled in for the night, the warmth of a fireplace filling the living room as I sat down and read. Outside, the wind howled, making the house creak, but I paid no mind to it. This place was old, after all, and had its quirks. It was just good to be here. But when I got to make up myself a cup of coffee, hot chocolate, I noticed something strange. There on a wooden floor leading from the back door to the stairs were footprints. They were faint, just outlines in the dust, but they were unmistakably here. I frowned. They didn't look my parents' prints nor mine. They were smaller, almost childlike. My heart skipped a bit. The house was empty, and all the doors were locked. Where could these footprints come from? As I followed them, the unease in my chest grew. The prints led to the staircase, up to the second floor, and then down the hallway towards the attic. No one had gone up there in years. It was cold, dark, and full of old junk, not worth exploring. But the footprints led straight to the attic door, which was slightly ajar. I hesitated. This was ridiculous. I was just booking myself out. This had to be some kind of prank. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly climbed the creaky stairs. The attic was just as I remembered it, dimly lit by a small dusty window, filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. But something was different. The footprints continued here, through the dust-coated floor, leading to the far corner of the room. I followed them, my breath catching in my throat. The footprints stopped at the wall, where an old tattered rug lay sprawled out. I knelt down, brushing it aside, and that's when I saw it, a small door, barely visible in the dim light, set into the floorboards. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door. I'd lived in this house my whole life, but I had never seen it before. Who had used it? What was behind it? I couldn't stop myself. I reached out, my hand trembling, and grasped the handle. It was cold to touch, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled it open. A musty smell wafted out. Beneath the door was a narrow, dark staircase. I hesitated just for a moment before descending. These steps groaned under my weight as I made my way down, the air growing colder and damper with each step. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, cramped room. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood, covering in dust and cobwebs, but there was nothing else. In the center of the room was a large old trunk. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. My curiosity piqued. I approached it and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were old newspaper, yellowed with age, and a few brittle, faded photographs. I carefully picked up one of the newspaper and unfolded it. The headline made my blood run cold. Family found slain in isolated home. Killer never caught. The article, a gruesome crime that had taken place in the very house I was standing in. Decades ago, a family had been murdered, their bodies discovered in the attic. The authorities never found the killer. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear motive, and the case went cold. The house had been sealed off for years before my parents bought it, totally unaware of the horrific past. As I sifted through the other papers, a sense of dread settled over me. The photographs were of the family, smiling and happy, completely unaware of the tragedy that would befall them. It was then that I realized what I had uncovered. This wasn't just an old attic. It was a tomb. The sealed rooms, the hidden door, were all part of the house dark history that was long forgotten. My hands trembled as I closed the journal. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Empty except the footprints that now led away from the trunk and towards the dark corner of the room. Panic set in. I had to get out of here. I stumbled back to the staircase and bolted out to the attic, my breath coming in short gasps as I reached the hallway. The house plunged into darkness. The house had gone out, leaving me in pitch blackness. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I fumbled downstairs, crushing into the furniture as I went through the rooms. Finally, I reached the front door. My only thought was to flee at any cost, away from whatever was in the house. Yanking the door open, I was hit by a blast of icy wind and swirling snow. The storm was still raging, the snow falling so thickly that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But I didn't care. I had to escape. I ran out into the storm and made it as far as the edge of the woods before I collapsed, the cold seeping into my bones. I huddled there, shivering, too terrified to go back inside. Even as the wind howled around me, the snow piled up. Luckily, right at the moment, I saw headlights approaching. My parents' car pulled into the driveway. Skidding slightly on the icy road, I stumbled to my feet, waving my arms frantically. They rushed out of the car, their faces pale with worry. "What are you doing out here?" my mother cried, pulling me into her arms. "You'll freeze to death." I tried to speak to tell them everything that had happened, but my teeth were chattering too hard. My father wrapped his coat around me. They led me back towards the house. I resisted, panic flaring up again, but they didn't understand. They thought I was just scared because of the storm. As we stepped inside, I braced myself for the cold, dark house, for the eerie presence I had felt earlier. But as soon as we crossed the threshold, everything was normal. The lights flickered back on, and the warmth of the house enveloped us. I stared in disbelief. My parents looked around, confused, but they didn't see anything unusual. I ran up to the attic, dragging them with me, desperate to show what I had found. But when we reached the attic, the secret door in the floor was gone. The rug undisturbed, the dust on the floor thick and unbroken. "He was here," I insisted, my voice shaking. "I found a room, the footprints." But there was nothing, no signs of anything that I had seen. My parents exchanged worried glances, clearly thinking that a storm and the isolation had gotten to me. They tried to calm me down, assured me that it was just my imagination, that nothing was wrong with the house. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and I know that whatever is in the house had somehow hidden itself away again, leaving no trace of its existence. But I couldn't explain it. I could only shiver as they led me back downstairs, where the fire was crackling warmly, as if nothing had ever happened. My parents tried to soothe me with hot chocolate and reassurances, but I couldn't stop trembling. Even now, days later, I can't stop thinking about it. The hidden room, the tragic story of the family, the footprints that led me to that terrible discovery. I haven't told anyone else what happened. Who would believe me? But I know one thing for sure. Some secrets are better left buried, and some doors should never be opened. The stranger at the door. I've lived in this neighborhood my entire life. It's a quiet place, tucked in a sleepy little town where nothing much ever happens. Our house is at the end of the cul-de-sac, surrounded by woods on one side and few other homes on the other. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, where doors are left unlocked and the biggest excitement is occasional block party. That Friday night was supposed to be no different. My parents were out of town for the weekend and I was looking forward to a quiet night. Maybe I'd order some pizza, catch up on a new show and just relax. It was the perfect setup for a low-key evening, until I heard the knock on the door. I figured it was probably a neighbor of someone delivering a package, so I got to answer it. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a man who looked 30s, maybe early 40s. He was dressed casually, jeans, a jacket, and a baseball cap pulled lower over his eyes. He looked completely ordinary, which is probably why I didn't feel alarmed. At first, he smiled a little too wide and said, "Hi there, sorry to bother you, but I'm kind of lost. Could you possibly use your phone to call a friend?" Something about his request felt off. These days, who doesn't have a phone? But I didn't want to be rude, so I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure, I guess," I said. Stepping back to let him in, I handed him my phone and watched as he dialed the number. He pressed the phone to his ears and waited, but something strange happened. He never spoke. After a few moments, he handed the phone back to me. "No answer," he said. He smiled falteringly, slightly. "Mind if I wait here for a bit, just until I can get hold of my friend?" Now, alarms were starting to go off in my head. The situation was getting weird, but I still didn't want to be the paranoid type who jumps to conclusion. I figured maybe he was genuinely lost or lost his phone was dead. I forced a smile and said, "Sure, just wait for a while." I led him to the living room where he sat down on a couch, making himself a little too comfortable. I sat in the armchair opposite to him, trying to keep the conversation light. "So, where were you headed?" I asked, hoping to keep these things casual. He looked around the room almost like he was inspecting it before replying, "Just visiting a friend nearby, not too familiar with this area." His eyes kept darting to my family photos on the wall, lingering on them a little too long. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at my things, like he was cataloging them. My unease was growing by the second. I started to regret letting him in, but I didn't know how to ask politely to leave, without making things awkward, or worse, provoking him. Then he started asking questions, personal questions. "So you live here? Alone?" he asked casually, but the way he said it, it sent a chill down my spine. "No, my parents are just out for a bit." I lied, trying to sound nonchalant. He nodded, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it suspicion? Curiosity? I couldn't tell, but it made me uncomfortable. Minutes passed and the man made no effort to leave or check his phone again. Instead, he kept trying to engage me in conversation, steering it toward increasingly personal topics. "I must have a lot of friends around here," he said. "Do they come very often?" Something about the way he asked was making me feel like he was probing, trying to figure out if anyone would be coming by. I could feel my pulse squinting. I needed to get him out of the house, but I didn't know how to do it without setting him off. I forced a laugh. Actually, it was just about he'd out to meet some friends. I lied. "I can give you directions to where you were going if you want, but I really need to get going." He looked at me for a long moment, his smile fading. "You know," he said weakly, "I think you're lying to me." My heart skipped a bit. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're not going anywhere," he said, standing up from the couch, "and I don't think your parents are coming back anytime soon either." Panic surged through me. How did he know that? Had he been watching the house? The realization that this man had likely been planning this filled with me. With terror, I needed to get out of here fast. I stood up, trying to appear calm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I think you should leave now," I said firmly, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't move. Instead, he just stared at me. A dark look passing over his face. "I don't think so," he said quietly. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. You're not going anywhere." I realized that this man wasn't just a random encounter. This man knew who I was. He had targeted me specifically, but I still didn't know why. Without warning, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react, but instinct kicked in. I dodged to the side and grabbed the nearest object. a lamp and swung at him. The lamp shattered against his shoulder, and he staggered back, but he wasn't down. I ran for the front door, but he was faster. He grabbed my arm, yanking me back. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, trying to be free. My mind was racing, desperate for a way out. I remembered the kitchen, knives. There were knives in the kitchen. I turned to face him, brandishing the knife between us. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice shaking with fear and rage. "Just get out and leave me alone." But he didn't stop. He lunged at me again, his hands outstretched, trying to knock my knife away. Without thinking, I slashed him. The blade cut deep into his arms, and he let out a howl of pain. Stumbling back, his blood began to pour from his wound. For a moment he stood there, clutching his arm, seemingly realizing that he had lost the upper hand. Breathing heavily, I held the knife out in front of me, ready to strike again if he came any closer. I said, "Get out!" I shouted, more forcefully this time. He staggered back, his hand still pressed against the bleeding wound. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I'll be back." With that, he turned and walked out of my house, slamming the door behind him, leaving a trail of blood on the floor. I stood there, trembling, the knife still in my hand, as the reality of what just had happened sank in. I didn't know who that man was, or why he had chosen me, but one thing was clear. I had narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. I quickly locked all the doors and called the police, my hands shaking as I dialed. When they arrived, I gave them the description of a man and told them everything that had happened. They promised to patrol the area, but I knew it would be a long time before I felt safe again. That night, I learned a valuable lesson, a lesson that I hope anyone who hears this story takes to heart. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't let politeness or fear of awkwardness put you to danger. I was lucky to get away, but not everyone is. I had seen that man since that night, but his words still haunt me. "I'll be back," he said, "but if he ever does come back, I'll be ready." The uninvited guest. I woke up that morning feeling awful, sore throat, pounding headache, and barely enough energy to lift myself out of the bed. My parents had left early for the big parade in town. I was supposed to go on, but in my condition, that was out of question. So there I was alone in the house, while everything else was out celebrating. I could hear the distant hum of excitement from the town square, even though it was miles away. The whole neighborhood had gone to the event, leaving me completely isolated. I spent most of the morning curled up on the couch, trying to distract myself with TV, but the loneliness was gnawing me. Around midday, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just a wind rattling the windows, but then I heard it again. More distinct this time. A faint scraping sound came from the back of the house. My heart skipped a bit. Slowly, I got up and moved towards the kitchen, where the noise seemed to be coming from. As I approached the back door, I saw it. The lock was being tampered. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, watching in horror as the door slowly creaked open. Two men slipped in, their faces partially hidden by masks. They didn't notice me at first, to focus on making sure the coast was clear. I ducked behind the kitchen island, my mind racing. What should I do? My phone was in the living room, too far to reach without being seen. The men started moving through the house, talking in low voices. They were here to rob the place, completely unaware that I was still inside. My heart pounded in my ears as I crawled towards the hallway, desperate to find a place to hide. My first thought was the pantry, but it was too obvious. I needed somewhere better. I made it to the stairs, praying that it wouldn't turn around and see me. I climbed them as quick as possibly, wincing with every creak. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, the only place I could think that might keep me safe. I slipped inside and gently closed the door, pressing my back against it as I tried to steady my breathing. I could hear him downstairs, rummaging through drawers, knocking things over. Every sound made me flinch. I know it was only a matter of time before they started searching up the rooms. I needed to act, but what could I do? I didn't have a weapon, and there was no way I could fight him off. Then it hit me. The attic. There was a small hatch in the ceiling of my closet that led there. It wasn't the best hiding spot, but it was all I had. I quickly moved into the closet and pushed a chair under the hatch. With shaking hands, I climbed up and lifted the panel. Pulling myself into the dusty space above, I carefully lowered the panel back into place, hoping they wouldn't notice it. The attic was dark and crumpled, filled with old boxes and forgotten junk. I squeezed myself into the corner, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Below, I could hear them moving around, getting closer. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest, but I couldn't believe that it's happening. After a short while, the men finally made their way upstairs. I could hear them opening doors, talking to each other in frustrated tones. They were looking for something specific, and it was clear they weren't going to leave until they found it. Then one of them spoke, his voice sharp and angry. "Someone's here," he said. My blood ran cold. They must have found something that tipped them off. Maybe the chair I used to climb the attic, or something I left out of place. I bit down hard on my lip to keep from making any noise. I heard footsteps in my room, the door creaking. They were close, too close. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find the attic hatch. Suddenly I heard a loud crash. They'd kick over the chair, probably trying to get me to react. I stayed perfectly still. Even as tears welled in my eyes, they were furious now, tearing the room apart, but they hadn't found the hatch yet. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit here waiting for them to find me. I had to escape them, then look for help. Slowly, I moved towards the hatch, praying it wouldn't make a sound. I gently pushed it open and peeked out. The room was a mess, but I couldn't see them. They must have moved on to another room. I slipped out of the attic, landing softly on the floor. I moved as quickly as quietly as I could down the hall. I could still hear the men nearby, but they hadn't noticed me. Unfortunately, clumsiness gave me away as I bumped into a shelf, making a loud noise. The men spun around, and their eyes yet met mine. Panicked, I turned back and ran, but they were fast. One of them grabbed me, pulling me back. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but he was too strong. "Let me go!" I shouted, trying to break free, but he just tightened his grip, dragging me back towards down the stairs. My mind was racing, searching for anything I could do to escape. Then I remembered the window in my hallway. It was old and probably wouldn't hold much weight, but it was only a chance. Twisted a man's grip, managing to break free. For just a second, I darted towards the window, praying I could get it to open in time. I threw open the window and scrambled onto the ledge, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. The drop to the ground was steep, but there was a small ledge. I could land on it if I jumped right. The man lunged at me, but I threw myself out the window before he could grab me. I landed hard on the ledge, pain shooting through my ankle. I didn't have time to think about it. I had to keep moving. I scrambled along the ledge, ignoring the throbbing in my ankle, until I reached the edge of the house. From there, it was a short drop to the ground. I took a deep breath and jumped. Hitting the ground harder than I expected, pain shot my leg, but I forced myself to get up and run. Behind me, I heard a man shouting, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could towards the street, hoping anyone would help me. My vision blurred with tears and pain, but I kept running, driven by sheer terror. Finally, I saw a car in the distance. I waved frantically, screamed for help. The car screeched to stop, and the driver jumped out, looking shocked. "What happened?" he asked, rushing towards me. "There were thieves in my house." I barely catch my breath. "Please help me." The man quickly pulled out his phone and called the police. I collapsed onto the ground, too exhausted to move. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, and I finally allowed myself to believe that it was over. The police arrived just in time, storming the house and apprehending the burglars before they could escape. I watched from the safety of the neighbor's yard, trembling with relief as they were led away in handcuffs. Later, as I sat back of the ambulance, wrapped in blanket, I couldn't help but think about how close I am to losing everything. The whole ordeal had lasted only a couple of hours, but it felt like a lifetime. I know I would never forget the fear that I had felt that day. But more than that, I would never forget how I managed to survive. The hidden cameras. It all started last Thursday. I was home alone, enjoying a rare evening off. The house was quiet, just the way I like it. After a quick shower, I settled down in the living room. I was flipping through the TV channels, not really paying attention, when I noticed something odd about the picture frame on the mantel. It was slightly crooked, which wasn't like me. I'm kind of obsessive about those things, so I got up to straighten it. But as I did, I noticed something behind the frame. There was a tiny lens peeking out from the corner of the frame, barely noticeable unless you were really looking for it. I froze, my mind racing. Who the hell would put a camera in my house? And how long had it been there? I yanked the frame off the wall and stared at the device, trying to make sense of what I just had found. Had someone else broken into my house? Why would they go to the trouble of installing a camera instead of just stealing things? That's when I realized I had to search the house. If there was one camera, there could be more. Without thinking, I started with the living room, checking behind every picture frame, every bookshelf. I pulled out on the cushions on the couch, looked under the coffee table, even inside a lamp. Nothing. But then, as I was about to move the next room, something caught my eye. The air vent above the TV. It looked different. I climbed up on a chair to get a closer look. Sure enough, there was another camera, nestled inside a vent. This one was even more discreet, embedded deep within a metal grating. My heart pounded in my chest as I carefully unscrewed the vent cover and pulled the camera out. I spent the next hour tearing through my house. I found another camera inside a smoke detector in my bedroom, and yet another inside a clock of a kitchen. I felt like I was losing my mind. Someone had gone to great lengths to monitor me, and they've been doing it from every room in this house. By the time I'd searched every room, I'd found total 6 cameras. 6, each one carefully hidden, expertly placed to capture my every move. I sat down on the edge of my bed, surrounded by the tiny devices.